The award that we're here to talk about today is the Ruth Patrick Award, and we lost Ruth recently. She showed us how to bring limnology and oceanography to bear on practical problems. She was very interested in biological diversity as a key for understanding environmental problems, a profound interest in diatoms. She created a limnology department. She was a major inspiration to limnologists and oceanographers. And this award honors research and application of basic science principles to the identification, analysis, and solution of important environmental issues, taking theory and making it work for the good of humankind. Our awardee this year is Daniel J. Conley. Daniel is a spectacular scientist, an old friend, and still a highly energetic and wonderful man to work with. I'm not going to talk much about his work because I'm going to let him do that. But he is being recognized for making science matter in addressing policy-relevant issues such as eutrophication, climate change, and with an aim to improve the scientific foundations for environmental policy decisions. And Daniel, I could talk a lot about you, but you'd rather talk and have your time. So if you'd come up and receive this award, I'd like you all to honor Daniel with a welcome, and he will present us a talk this morning. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. Thank you. So first of all, I would like to say that I'm really honored to receive this award, that your colleagues are willing to nominate you and think that your work is important enough is really fantastic to have. It's also important for me because ASLO is my scientific home. I walk across the salinity boundary, working both in freshwater, coastal marine systems, and more salty places too. And it's fantastic to have this opportunity. But I didn't just get to this place by myself. There were a variety of other people that have stimulated my interest. I've heard about Ruth Patrick throughout my whole life. I've worked with diatomists and have heard lots of stories about her. And you saw from John, she's just an iconic person. And it was sad to lose her this year. But I think it's a little ironic that I've won the Ruth Patrick Award because Ruth Patrick studies diatoms. And what I've done for most of my career is I take diatoms, I put them in a strong base, I boil them up, and I send them back to the elements from which they came and study silica cycling. So I do think that's a little bit ironic. But I got here because I've really had great mentors throughout my life. There's a variety of people that have influenced me tremendously and helped me along my way. And I thank those people, especially the two people at the top left of the screen, Claire Shelsky, who is my major professor. And he was also the Ruth Patrick Award winner in 2003. And then Gene Stormer, who's a well-known diatomist. We lost him a couple years ago. And in 2007, he won the award for excellence from the Phycological Society. And I have lots of other people. When you do ecosystem science, you don't do ecosystem science alone. And I must say, I have really fantastic colleagues. And I wasn't able to put everyone's pictures up here, but you know who you are. And it's been so wonderful to work with this talented group of people. Also, I have really good science friends, and they're such an important part of what I do, is that you have this trust and camaraderie with other people. And finally, I have a fantastic family and that has supported me throughout. And so for that, thank you very much for honoring me with this award. So I have a chance to talk about a topic that's been near and dear to me the last 7 years, and it's about geoengineering. And when I moved from Denmark to Sweden, I ended up getting money from an organization called Baltic Sea 2020, who wanted to fix the Baltic Sea by the year 2020. And they had something on the order of $100 million to do this. And so we got money from them to run a series of workshops about geoengineering. Since that initial funding, there's a variety of other people that have helped with this as well. And that's what I'll talk about today. And what you see in the background of this slide is actually cyanobacteria blooms during the summer in the Baltic Sea and taken from satellites. So I'm going to give you a little bit about general concepts and talk about hypoxia in the open Baltic Sea, but also talk about problems with hypoxia in the coastal zone. I'll talk a little bit about impact on biogeochemical cycles, because that's the area that I'm most interested in, and then talk about these different geoengineering approaches. So what is geoengineering? If you go, it mostly actually centers on climate science, and the definition that you see most often used is this deliberate large-scale manipulation of an environmental process that affects the Earth's climate in an attempt to counteract the effects of global warming. But it turns out the term geoengineering is being used for all eco-technological approaches as well, not only things with climate change. And if you're interested in it, I would strongly encourage you to read these two reports, one from the Royal Society and one more recently from the National Academy of Sciences, that talk about the whole range of not only the types of geoengineering that could be done, but some of the philosophy behind why we do it, and more importantly, some of the potential dangers and benefits. I work in the Baltic Sea because it's one of the most eutrophied places in the world. If you study eutrophication, it's a great place. We have problems with algal blooms that wash up on shore. We have red tides. We have fish kills. We have disruptions in food web. And we have massive hypoxia. But the question is how are you going to fix this? You know, what kind of geoengineering approaches can you use to fix these multitude of problems with different stressors and different causes? And why do you want to do this? And there are several answers to those questions. And one is by reducing nutrients, which we know is one of the biggest problems in the Baltic Sea, is that it's going to take time. It took 100 years to get where we are today. It will take decades to get back. And geoengineering promises very quick remedies. These costs of reducing nutrient inputs to society are really enormous. We're talking about having major changes in land use as well, and how we deal with everything from the wastes we produce to how we grow food. And geoengineering provides a cheaper alternative, supposedly, to make these changes. And it's also very popular in the media and popular with politicians because it could be done on the cycle of an election. But there are ethical implications, and why are we doing this? And you know, I think most people, at least where I live today in Sweden, are doing it because they want to be able to swim and not have algal blooms during the summer. Some people are more interested in turning the Baltic Sea into a refrigerator so that every time you throw out your hook, you can bring in a cod. But it's this whole concept that we as human beings have control over nature. And I think on these really large ecosystems, in some way, we have much less control than we think we do. And I'll come to that a little bit later in this discussion. But the Baltic Sea plays such an important role in all the countries around the Baltic in terms of how the people view living on the Baltic Sea, as well as this amazing economic resource too. Geoengineering is on its way in Sweden, whether we want it or not. The Swedish Environmental Protection Agency funded some projects a few years ago to the tune of $5 million to try and pump water downward to bring oxygen into the system, and I'll talk about that in a moment. The Swedish National Fisheries Board instituted a program to alter trophic interactions in the Baltic Sea. And finally, there's this organization called Baltic Sea 2020 that has $100 million and they'll spend that by 2020. And they have this project called the Living Coast, where they're actually adding chemicals to near shore communities, coastal marine communities, to precipitate out phosphorus and store it in the sediments. The Baltic Sea is the largest anthropogenically impacted low oxygen zone in the world. This is a picture of the southern Baltic Sea. The blue is waters that are less than 4 milliliters per liter, and the purple is 2 milliliters per liter. Although we often think of oxygen hypoxia being less than 2 milligrams per liter. They're roughly equivalent. There are some differences. But you can see this massive area. It averages 49,000 square kilometers over the last 50 years, which is just an incredible area. In the United States, when you talk about the Gulf of Mexico dead zone, you always compare it to New Jersey. We compare it to Denmark. And it's actually larger than the size of a country. It's really, it's impressive to have this, but it's not something we're necessarily proud of. A couple years ago, we did another slide. This is work that we just recently published. And it turns out that oxygen measurements have been made in the Baltic Sea since the late 1800s. The Winkler method was made in 1888. And we were using different statistical techniques to go back and reconstruct the history of hypoxia in the Baltic Sea. And one of the things you can see is that hypoxia was low at the turn of the century. There were probably areas of the Baltic that have always been hypoxic due to hydrological restrictions. And it might be anywhere from a couple thousand to 5,000 square kilometers. But you can see this rapid increase after World War II. And when farming practices changed and we had the industrialization of agriculture and urban populations started to grow. And you can see that it's reached something on the order of 65,000 square kilometers today. It goes from below the halocline, so it goes from 100 meters deep to something on the order of the bottom, which is 200 meters deep. So it's a thick layer of about 100 meters, and it's permanent. In the very western part of the Baltic, some of it in the Danish Straits is seasonal, but most of the hypoxia in the Baltic is there permanently, although it does vary from year to year. A couple years ago, we put together all the coastal data that weren't in a database prior to this. And we looked at where hypoxia occurred in coastal marine ecosystems. And it turned out there were 215 sites out of the 613 sites where we had data where hypoxia occurred, where you had concentrations that were at least less than 2. You can't see it so well, but all the black dots on the figure are areas that actually had gone anoxic with no oxygen in the water column. And you can see the distribution is very skewed. In the northern part of the Baltic Sea, these two basins, the Bothnian Sea and the Bothnian Bay, actually most of them are green. The red dots were from paper plants, and when they used to just put the raw waste out, and you created this incredible oxygen demand. And those have been fixed today. On the southern Baltic Sea coast along Poland and Estonia and Germany, you have very sandy, open systems. And so there's really very little hypoxia that can occur because of physical constraints. But you go to all the enclosed ecosystems, whether they're in the archipelagos or along the coast here, you have really abundant amount of hypoxia. And this is interesting because Bob Diaz and Rutger Rosenberg did a survey, and they published it in Science a few years ago, and they found 400 coastal marine ecosystems that had hypoxia. And we have found another 215 systems that have it. And it's not good. So what is the impact on biogeochemical cycles? We know that when you have low oxygen zones, you kill organisms in the bottom, higher organisms. It's great for microbial communities, but not necessarily for the kinds of things that we want, especially fish. But the biggest impact is on the phosphorus cycle. When you don't have oxygen in the bottom water, you can't store phosphorus in the sediments, and it comes up into the water. And in this figure, the lines, the black lines, are isopleths of oxygen, and the colors are phosphorus concentrations. And you can see that whenever we have these long periods of hypoxia, we build up massive amounts of phosphorus in the water. Some of that phosphorus makes it up to the surface, and it causes cyanobacteria blooms. And so we have this vicious circle of phosphorus coming up from the bottom, having excess phosphorus during the summer. On the years when it's actually warm enough to grow cyanobacteria blooms and not windy, we can have massive cyanobacteria blooms that fix nitrogen. They can fix about 1/3 of the total phytoplankton demand every year. And then they sink to the bottom and then create more hypoxia because there's more organic matter coming down. So most of the geoengineering has been trying to put oxygen back in the Baltic to break this vicious cycle and to stop the leakage of phosphorus from the sediments. Again, the question that was asked is, are there technical solutions available that we could use to speed up this process? One of the things that we did, we first calculated how much oxygen it takes if you need it just to add pure oxygen down. People talk about, oh, we just bubble air down. Or it turns out that it would require 2 to 6 million tons to be added each year to the Baltic Sea. And to put it into a number that we could think about, it's 20 to 60,000 railroad cars of pure liquid oxygen to the bottom of the Baltic to keep it oxic. And you know that is absolutely impossible to do. So it's just an enormous problem. When we were doing this work, we couldn't necessarily address all the different things that were proposed. And it's amazing what ideas people are coming up in their basement to do things. But we focused on 4 different things, and one of them was Deepwater oxygenation, and we found that was impossible. But one of the things that they talked about is we need more saltwater inflows into the sea, into the Baltic. We have salt water that comes in from the Danish Straits, and it brings oxygenated water in. But the problem is that it's rapidly utilized in the water column, and a large Baltic inflow will become anoxic within a period of 6 months because all the demand for oxygen in the bottom waters. But what it does is it creates much more stability in the water column and much more stratification. So if you would do something like dig out the Drogden sill so more salt water would come in the Baltic, you would actually have worse hypoxia in the system. And the other popular one that people talk about is let's just turn it into a lake. Let's put up some dams and allow shipping to go through, so it would be just a little bit salty. But it turns out that it would get even worse for a number of years. Plus, it would be changing the ecosystem to something that's not the Baltic Sea. And then finally, we were investigating this idea about pumping water down, so going below the permanent halocline at 80 meters and pumping that water down to 120 meters to bring oxygen downward. And there's been some experiments done that have tested this, and I would like to talk about those because they have really important implications about what some of the problems that can arise are. There was this project called the Box Project, where they mechanically pumped water below the halocline. And one of the interesting things that they did is by pumping lower salinity water downward, they basically lowered the stratification potential, and it allowed salt water from an adjacent basin to come in that had more oxygen in it. And so if you would do this at the scale of the Baltic Sea, you would probably create many more Baltic inflows, which in the long run would actually counteract what you're trying to do. There was also another project in Finnish coastal waters called Proppen, and it was in shallow coastal areas. And they were pumping warmer, higher oxygenated water downwards. They have very small salinity gradients there, that most of it is governed by our thermocline, downward. But it heated the sediments by as much as 2 to 4 degrees. And what it did is it caused much more remineralization. And it also spread the hypoxic area out. They were measuring ammonium concentrations that are found in sewage treatment plants and took a system next to it and made that hypoxic too by spreading the water out. So there's very serious considerations that we have to think about when we institute these kinds of geoengineering. There's this group of entrepreneurs that are trying to do it in Denmark and put it into the Bornholm Basin. And they want to do a pilot project with one windmill. They suggested it would take maybe 100 windmills around the Baltic Sea to oxygenate the bottom waters. And it's interesting talking to colleagues here. It turns out they want to do this on Lake Erie too now. And I think this is very dangerous and very interesting at the same time. As a scientist, these experiments are fascinating that you manipulate a system, but I think the potential for catastrophe is large. And it gets to another question, is who decides? And they have come to the conclusion, these entrepreneurs, that in the European Union, we have these agreements between the different countries. If one country agrees upon it, according to the ESPO convention, then all the other countries have to go on it. And so is it going to be the Danish Energy Agency, whose primary job is to approve windmills in waters, that makes the decision for all the Baltic Sea countries? And I think this is really an important question, because there are other geoengineering things that have been suggested. In Finland, they've actually suggested to suck all the bottom sediments out of the deep zones and mine them for phosphorus, thus removing the phosphorus sink that's in the bottom waters. And I think it's an important question on who makes the decision and decides what geoengineering tool is appropriate. There are a whole variety of questions that go with this kind of mixing. In lakes, by mixing the water, you don't always, or bubbling the water, you don't always affect the phosphorus balance in the system, because the sediments are still anoxic and you still have the reactions bringing phosphorus into the water column. There are a variety of other things that we're really concerned about, and that is, will we actually destratify the water and break through the permanent halocline and have waters mixed down to a deeper level and bring these nutrients up to the surface, but also change the phytoplankton communities and the fish communities as well? What would the effect be of putting 100 windmills around the Baltic on shipping? And I think the other two most important things is the costs are enormous to set up a system of 100 windmills, keep it running. And if you don't reduce nutrients, you're going to have to keep the system running perpetually, because the sediment demand of oxygen will cause it to go hypoxic again. And then the thing that we're worried about, if you start dumping lots of money into engineering and quick fixes that people will ignore, actually addressing the real problems. So there are a couple other things that I wanted to mention. One is this thing with phosphorus sequestration and adding alum to the Baltic. There are different entrepreneurs that are looking at different chemicals that you can use besides alum. Alum is very energetically expensive. It produces a lot of CO2, but it's also extremely expensive to use. This one small system in the Stockholm archipelago, it cost about $2 million to add phosphorus to this small coastal marine system. They think that it will last about 10 years before they probably have to do another treatment to keep the phosphorus levels down. But the interesting thing, they still have a large oxygen demand in the sediments. So the bottom waters are still hypoxic, but the phosphorus is fixed with the alum in the sediments. And then there's these questions about reversibility. Once you start adding chemicals to systems, you can't take them back. And it's probably also banned by the London Convention too. There's also been work on changing the trophic structure in Denmark. We've done it already through overfishing. But one of the problems is there's a lot of sprat. It's a small fish like herring. And it has been eating the cod eggs, and they're very large abundances. It's not a fish that's used for food directly. It's often used for fish oil. And so the concept was, for 3 years, they tried to fish out all the sprat out of the Baltic. And one of the things that happened, though, is that the cod are starving now. And I'm not implying that fishing out the sprat had anything to do with the cod starving. It had more to do, probably, with the fact that there were several big year classes. And they have these really large year classes that are there, and there's not enough fish to support them. But it shows that we start to push one side of the system, and another side of the system reacts differently from the way we thought it was going to react. I think that we're on the pathway to a healthier marine ecosystem in the Baltic. It's one of the most studied systems in the world. We have tremendous amounts of basic knowledge. We have a coordinated monitoring and assessment program from all the countries around the Baltic. We have a governance scheme in place with the Helsinki Commission, and we also have an action plan for reducing nutrients that was signed by all the countries in 2013. And there are also ways to make countries make these nutrient reductions by 2020. There are actually financial penalties they have to pay if they don't reach this. And so I think we're definitely on the way to having a better and cleaner Baltic Sea. And so I think in all this excitement of all this money around for the entrepreneurs to do geoengineering, I think we have to focus our efforts on mitigation in the Baltic and focus our efforts on reducing nutrients. There's still lots of things and places where nutrients need to be reduced that really haven't been addressed yet. Our biggest problem in the Baltic Sea today are the large animal facilities. About half the nitrogen comes in from the large animal facilities, and that number is growing as we're eating more and more meat and exporting that around the world. So I was inspired by Randy Olson on Sundays, so I have an and, but, and therefore. And nutrient inputs have stimulated the growth of algae and has created the largest anthropogenically induced low oxygen zone in the world. And geoengineering promises rapid improvements. But the potential ecological effects could be devastating for the Baltic Sea ecosystem by implementing geoengineering. Therefore, I think we must focus on the prescribed nutrient reductions to have a better and healthier Baltic Sea. So thank you for listening, and thank you so much for bestowing me with this award.